Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Ayers, the Director of Communications at the Realtor Association of the Fox Valley, and welcome to the first edition of our new panel series, Real Estate Experience Live. This is a series created by the RAFE Technology and Communications Committee. The goal of this series is to tackle real issues in real estate with realtors. Our plan is to do this monthly, so be looking for this every month right here on Facebook. The first topic we are tackling is multiple offers. But before we get into the discussion, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for joining us and for sharing your knowledge on this topic. And also, we would like to thank everyone in the viewing audience for joining us. If you have any questions during the viewing, be sure to put them in the comments and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So with that, let's get started. The first panelist that we have is Michael Simpson, Designated Managing Broker with Baird & Warner Algonquin, past RAFE President and our current RAFE Realtor of the Year. Go ahead and say hello, Michael.
Hello, Michael.
Next, we have Laura Boyer, Regional Vice President with Coldwell Banker Real Estate Group, and she's based out of the Sycamore office. Why don't you go ahead and wave, Laura?
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
Next, we have Chris Davis, Designated Managing Broker of Inspire Realty Group in Elgin. Go ahead and say hello.
Guys, thank you for having me. Hello, guys.
Next, we have Karen Smith, Designated Managing Broker of Berkshire Hathaway HomeServices Starck Real Estate in Elgin. Go ahead and say hello.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And finally, we have Ron Ewing, Designated Managing Broker for Remax Horizon in Elgin, an RAFE past president and a past Realtor of the Year.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to our moderator, Bruce Berkalow, Designated Managing Broker of Remax Deal Makers in Hampshire and current chairperson of RAFE's Technology and Communications. Go ahead, Bruce, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. How are you? I hope everyone is doing well today. Is what I'm going to do is we have a list of questions here that people have sent in, and I'll ask each one of you the question, and you can all answer in your own words. So we'll get right to it here. When an agent comes to you and says, a second offer came in on one of my listings, what do you do? What do you tell them? Ron, do you want to go first?
Sure. Bruce, I assume it's an agent presenting an offer. Is that correct?
Yes.
So my first thought is to go back to my listing agreement and make sure that the seller has given me permission to disclose that there's multiple offers. And then if that's the case, then I can certainly go to the other agent and say, we have another offer at the time. And then my next thought is to go back to the seller and find out what they would like me to do with multiple offers, because it's always the seller's direction that I'm going to take when I have multiple offers. And there's a lot of different ways to handle the multiple offers, so I'll let some of the other panelists talk about that. But that's my first thought when I get a multiple offer is, what has my seller directed me to do, and can I disclose it to the other agent?
Sure. How about you, Michael?
Well, first I say congratulations. That's always important if you got double offers or multiple offers. And then I always go back to, I usually ask the agents right away, how did you address this with the sellers during the listing presentation? Because it really matters what you do up front. If you can do the right thing up front, it makes the process a lot easier on the back end. It's a lot easier when you can say, remember, we talked about this during the listing presentation. Here's what we have before us. Here's how we're going to handle it. So I put a lot of emphasis on what they did up front. But in the event that they have done that or we're ready to move forward with it, I usually try to say that we should keep it as simple as possible for the sellers. A lot of things that we're dealing with, they don't understand the same way we do. So I just try to keep it simple, provide a side-by-side comparison of the negotiables, forget all the other busy work about the contract, provide side-by-side with the negotiables, and then help the, put the sellers in the best position to make a good informed decision about what to do going forward.
So it's educate, educate, educate.
Absolutely.
Karen, how about you?
I would agree with all those things. A few of my agents, and I've also seen this in the multiple listing service, sometimes have, when they put a listing up, have said, because they've talked about this with their sellers and they know it's a hot market and the inventory is low, to put on the listing that they're not going to accept any offers for 2 days, 5 days, whatever the case may be. And that sometimes I think helps a little bit in that situation.
Laura?
Yeah. Well, I really piggybacking on what everybody else has already said too. Besides knowing that you have the permission, the written direction from the seller to disclose the multiple offers, once you do make that notification, I recommend that they notify all the agents through an email, but not copying every agent so every agent sees who has submitted offers. I always recommend and tell them, make sure you BCC all of the agents to notify them in writing if there is a multiple offer situation, if you do indeed have that permission to disclose it. So I start with that. I'm sure we'll touch on escalation clauses soon, so we can kind of address how you do that in that multiple offer situation as well. But making sure you get notice out in a timely fashion. But like you said, educating with your sellers and having that conversation up front, I think will also give them a chance to kind of pump the brakes and take a breath before they have to start reviewing those side-by-side offers. So giving that deadline out at a reasonable amount of time. I mean, between the buyers and their schedules and agent schedules, giving at least a 24-hour period, I think is ideal to give those agents a chance to respond with a reconsideration of offers.
Chris?
Yeah, I would actually do the same thing. Obviously, contact the seller. Obviously, that should have been already discussed in the beginning of the listing agreement. If you do proceed to go into multiple offers, even notify the upcoming appointments to view the home, letting those know that they are going into a multiple offer situation if they're going to proceed with an offer.
Interesting. Okay. So we have a B side to this question. So when an agent comes to you and says, my client really wants the house, but it already has an offer on it, what can I do to get this house for them? What do you tell them?
I like to say, kind of in other words, to the client, you know, what price and terms, because it's not always about price, but what price and terms will it be, or will it take for you to not lose sleep over it at night? So, you know, I'd hate for you to wake up in the morning and realize you lost the bid and say, well, shoot, I totally would have closed sooner or paid 5,000 more, or I had more in earnest money, kind of like you referenced, Chris. So I think that that's the first thing I say to them is, how's it going to feel if you don't get it? And then the other part, I said it earlier, an escalation clause. That's another way to help win and offers, but we can talk more about what happens when you have two escalation clauses coming in on the same property. So I've won several with that as well.
Okay, thank you. Karen?
The key really is education, which we've all touched on. Educating your seller, educating your buyers. I would tell my buyers, first of all, if we have a multiple offer situation, you have 24 hours usually. And that's always nice because it gives them time to sleep on it. And I always say, go home and sleep on it. And the same thing as Laura said, you know, how are you going to feel if you don't get this house? How do you really, do you really want it? And the 24 hours a lot of times is helpful because it gives them a little bit of breathing room and time to think. Use the price escalation clause. We've done quite well with those. And then really, again, the education and letting them know, you know, you may, if you really want this house, or how are you going to feel? What's your strongest offer? That's the offer we should go in with, you know, price, closing, how much money to put down, whether you're putting it as is or not. Those are all things that, you know, they're going to have to look at. So the decision is theirs and we just give them the knowledge to make that choice.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Michael, what's your take on this?
Very similar to most everything that's been said here. I'll kind of go back to what I said about working with the sellers. It really matters what you've done with your buyer up front. So when you have your buyer consultation in the very beginning, you ought to spend a lot of time talking about, here's what happens when you find a property that you want to buy. These are the kind of things that are going to happen. These are the kind of circumstances that are going to come up. Here's the kind of things I'm going to present to you to help you make a decision at that time. But ultimately, if it's a house you really want, buy it. Quit monkeying around with it. Just buy the house, and don't play games with it. So I think it really matters a lot if you've had that discussion up front, if you've really educated them about what the process is. I think when you get to this point, it's a lot easier to help them, make the decision that they need to make to actually buy the house.
Very good. And Ron.
Yeah, a lot of good suggestions here. One of the things when we get above list price on these homes is maybe suggest to the buyer that they waive their appraisal price. So in other words, if the appraisal comes in lower, they're still going to make up the difference between the appraisal price and their purchase price. That gives the seller a lot of confidence that you're going to be able to move forward with the purchase of the home. Especially, I've had instances in my office where there's $20,000 above list price now, which is huge, and it appraised out. But my first reaction was, this property's never going to appraise out. And with a waiver of the appraisal, that would be a good instance where the seller would have the assurance that this buyer's still going to move forward.
Very good, very good. And in the top of that, it only, what is it, $25 per $5,000? I mean, you want the property right. It's not as big of a deal as it seems sometimes.
Absolutely. You have to know where your buyer's threshold of pain is, definitely.
Very good. Okay, on to the next question here. So what techniques have worked the best for you during the multiple offer situation? Taryn, would you go first?
Sure. Aside from the education piece, I think we use the price escalation clause quite often. We've also had in cases where there's somebody in the house that's not vacant, the buyers write a letter just telling them how much they would enjoy the house, and that seems to have worked quite well in many cases.
So just for audience purposes, sometimes we have realtors that have seasoned realtors that are watching this recording, and then of course we have other ones that have been or that are new. Can you explain the escalation clause a little bit?
It's when, and you have to do a lot of explaining to your buyers at that point to let them know that it might not appraise out, because again, we've had the same situation. I myself wrote an escalation clause where we went in $20,000 over, and we didn't get it, by the way. But you go in and you make an offer, and it's contingent, and it's not contingent. You make the offer, and it's up to a certain amount. And so say the house was $200,000, you're going to go in at $220,000. Well, you're going to go in up to, let's say, $1,000 over the highest offer, up to possibly $220,000. So they'll pay, if the offer comes in at the next highest offer is at $210,000, then you would pay, your clients would pay $211,000.
Okay.
And that seems to have worked well, but I know that in my situation, and also in working with a lot of the brokers in the office, there are lots of brokers who have never worked with an escalation clause before. And I've had brokers, listing agents, come back to me and say, what is this? How do I use this? And so you kind of have to educate them as well. And I think they're a little nervous about it. And I understand why. It's, it takes a little, savvy to do kind of things like that.
Okay. So Laura, the same two questions to you. What techniques have worked for you in the best? And what can you explain the escalation clause and how you've used it?
It's interesting because I actually just used it with a broker, like Karen mentioned, that has not used it before. One, let me just say we're very fortunate that we have a pre-made form with our association to use. I don't recommend playing attorney and writing in your own clause. So I would just kind of preface this with that. So if you do want to use it, use what we have provided through Realtor Association of Fox Valley, because it does protect your client from the appraisal standpoint as well. All of that language is in there, so get familiar with that form before you do that. Or if you have questions, speak with your designated managing broker for sure. What's great about that, and why that technique had just worked for me just last week, is because my buyer's max bid was just over asking price, only competing against one other offer. But what was interesting was the other offer was actually quite low. So because of the escalation clause, her max bid was over asking price, but we ended up getting it for $11,000 less than what her max bid was, because the other competing offer was low. So it doesn't just work to win a bid, but it also can work to save your client money in some situations. So I think that that's a fabulous thing to use if used correctly. Like Karen said, it does take a little bit of education. And I think it's okay as a broker to say, I'm not familiar with this. Can you walk me through it? Just as the broker did with me. And we talked through it, and he went through it with his attorney on that side, and everybody was comfortable with it. I think our form's really well written, and it pretty much covers all the bases. So get with your managing broker, review that form, and get comfortable with it before using it in a situation where time is of the essence. And that's
you,
about
Lauren.
it. The other thing I would say, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
That's okay.
The other thing I do ask the listing agent, is there anything you can tell me that is the most important to the seller? Because sometimes it's not about the price. Sometimes they have family waiting for them in another state, or they got to move quicker, and a quicker close is more important. So people tend to think that they got to pay this top dollar, but it's not always about that. So if they have the ability to disclose that with their seller's permission, what are the most important items that means the most to them, then let's start with that. And that can help your buyer also get a leg up on their offer. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Ron, what's your take?
Sure. I think in this escalation clause, I'd like to bring out one of the things that could be a downside to using the escalation clause. If the seller decides to work with the buyer that uses the escalation clause, they automatically know what their top dollar is that they're willing to pay for the property. So in other words, they've given away some of their negotiation tools in the transaction, because now they know, where they're potentially going to go with it. So there is a downside to using that escalation clause, and I think you need to explain that to your buyer when you enter into that type of strategy with them in multiple offers. As far as all kinds of multiple offers, obviously the highest and best is a tool that we use most often, but a seller can work with one offer and exclude the other offers, or can choose to work with all offers at the same time. So they've got a lot of tools at their disposal.
Very good. Chris, what's your take?
We'll even do a wave inspection. Once again, that's also depending on the house, right? And what year that was built, and obviously be very aggressive on the purchase price.
And have you used the escalation clause?
Yeah, yes, and I do like that too. I do have to agree that there are some stipulations there where Ryan hit it right on the head as far as they know that cap amount.
Michael, what's your take?
Well, I'll talk about the escalation first. I'm not a huge proponent of using the escalation clause. I mean, it obviously has its place, and if more of the outcome was the one Laura mentioned about saving the client money, I'd be more of a fan of it. But that's typically not the case. They're typically going to pay more money. But I think another thing Laura was talking about that was my kind of thoughts on this particular topic is that, I think the best tactic is to really try to understand what's important in the transaction before you start just throwing numbers around. I think there are a whole lot of negotiables that you can talk about other than price that might be appealing to the seller and not really an overburden on the buyer. So things like timing, making earnest money hard, waiving inspection, doing some of those kind of things. I think those can play a big role And so I think, it's really a matter about understanding what's really important to the parties in the transaction, and, helping your buyer understand which ones they can give and take on is a good tactic to use.
Very good. Very good information. Very good information. So, what things have backfired? Maybe they could have handled different, or maybe better in a multiple offer situation that maybe you've experienced or had one of your agents experience. How about Laura? You go first.
Sure. I could say what's backfired, an escalation clause. So what you guys say, it's very real. And like I think I even said, like in some situations it can be helpful, but I agree. You got to know what's important first and start from there. I think on the seller representation side, it's backfired where the seller is trying to change the rules after the fact. Now they get excited because there's many offers on the table and they're like, wow, I can just, have my pickings. But when they want to try to start pitting the offers against each other, and it's, well, can you go back and ask that agent if they'll match the same, closing date as this one? Or will you see if this other one will match the price of that third one? I mean, I think it's very sticky. And I think you have to kind of do a regroup then and talk with them about I talk about the mojo. They're excited, you're excited. Let's not start off on the wrong foot by dragging this out and creating a little animosity amongst the offers that have been presented to you. So let's be grateful for what we have and let's work with that, because we can get to what your ultimate goal was, what is, whatever that was that we discussed at the beginning of this process. So sometimes I think you just kind of have to regroup and pump the brakes a second and reevaluate what the end goal is originally.
Very good. Very good. Karen?
Things that have backfired have been price escalation clauses. If we put one in and it was very high, and the other broker I didn't think feel comfortable, and neither did the seller, that it was going to appraise out. And even though we waived appraisal, they just weren't comfortable with it. So they accepted another offer instead. Now it ends up they came back a few days later and said, okay, how does this work with the price escalation clause?
Yeah.
First offer, and I thought, well, but my people had already moved on by that point. So I think that, as Laura said, you can't really play around with too many things. You have to move. Everybody wants to move kind of quickly, especially in this kind of market. But you have to be thoughtful in how you move forward. So education, as we've all said before, is the key. And when you're talking with your sellers ahead of time and kind of prepping them for this, and when you're talking with your buyers ahead of time and helping them put their best foot forward if this is the house they really want, those are the things that work the best.
Good advice. Good advice. Michael?
Yeah, so on the seller side, I think the thing that has backfired the most is when you get the multiple offers and the first reaction is to go ahead and call for highest and best, and then you do that, and before anything has really transpired or you've really thought about it much, and then both parties walk away. That's really a problem. That's a real bad backfire. And you would have probably had that discussion with the seller and told them that's a possibility and that's what they wanted to do anyway. On the buyer side, I think it's not being willing to play in the highest and best game, because I've had to tell buyers before that when the seller calls for highest and best, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to change your offer. It's if you're just going to walk away because you say I don't want to play that game, I think that you don't really want to buy that house then. But if you do, your highest and best could be the offer that you've already presented. And I've done that before, and they've got the offer, they've got the bid on that basis of just representing the offer that they presented. Because highest and best, different than escalation clause, deals with a lot of things that are not price. So highest and best can take into a lot more account things than escalation does. So I think that's where the backfire has been for me in the past, is where people don't want to do the highest and best scenario and walk away from it.
Ron?
Yeah, I had a situation just recently that Michael just described, and that was highest and best, and both of them walked away. So, real life situation more than just a couple of weeks ago. But I was able to grab the one of the buyers by the shirt collar and say, "Hey, we'll reconsider. What do you think?" And, they came back, of course. So, that certainly is a real life situation that happens. And unfortunately, it happens more than you think. I guess the only other thought I want to add to this topic is that my sellers tend to start getting greedy. They got multiple offers on the table.
Yeah.
We've already had the discussion about what they're willing to accept for their property. And now all of a sudden they're getting higher than what they accept. And we start fighting about $1,000. And it often I have to go back and remind them, wait, we're above where you originally were going to, what you were going to get in the beginning. And now all of a sudden it comes down to just a few dollars, and we've lost both of them, or we've offended someone. Even worse is offending someone in the transaction, and then the rest of the transaction goes south from there.
Yeah. Chris, what's your take?
We ran into a situation lately where we did call highest and best, and this type of market where we're getting 10 to 50 for a list price. And seller getting all excited, we're going to accept this offer. I can't believe we got this much for my house. Then the house does not appraise. Now the seller is upset at us. We're trying to fight with the appraisal. And obviously we all know that fighting with the appraisal never worked and never turned over. And then it's a disappointment over to the seller. But once again, when you get that in that situation, is to explain to that seller accepting such a higher offer for the house is, hey, we may have that chance where it does not appraise, and we'll have to figure that out once we get to that point.
Yeah, that's always a problem, right? All the deciding factors on everything, the appraisal, all the other things that go into play. How can realtors help their clients select an offer without violating any fair housing rules? Any other rules that come into play?
Sure can. So I always tell my seller to go ahead and stick with what's on the contract itself. Explain when we first meet at a listing appointment about love letters. Get into that. I am not a big fan of love letters just because it's the fair housing. And I fully explained that right in the beginning that we need to stick to what is actually inside the contract.
Ron, what's your take?
Yeah, fair housing. I try not to. Sellers always want to know, who's buying their house and a little bit of background in them. I'm not a big fan of love letters either because often someone's given too much information rather than too little. One of the downsides to a seller actually meeting the buyer is that, people are honest and they give away too much information. So it hurts the negotiation for me most often when buyers and sellers meet. But that leads to another, thought process because there's judgment involved, be it good or be it bad, judgment involved. And one of the other things is I never show the signature page until I've gone through all the terms. I mean, the buyer names don't matter. Really what matters is if they have the money, can they afford to buy the house? Are the terms the right terms for us to be able to accept this offer? Those are the things that are most important. And names and background really don't matter. How many kids and all the other things that sellers typically want to know.
So you sway away from the love letters. What do you tell your clients in that situation?
Well, there isn't anything I can do. If a love letter comes along with an offer, I'm going to present it because my obligation is to present all offers. And if indeed that information becomes information I can use in negotiation, because a buyer gives too much information, then I'm going to use that to my advantage. But it works on both sides. Sellers often give away too much information when they talk to a buyer or if they get to talk to a buyer.
Yeah. So real quickly, Ron, what have you seen in love letters? Maybe, there again with the audience that we have with us, maybe some of them never experienced that.
Well, things that could cause problems is they might describe, I own a company and I have, this type of background in finance or something that says I have more money than what I'm actually offering you for the purchase of your home. Those are the clues that I'm looking for as a negotiator for my sellers. So that's where it can work against you. Now, I've certainly had enough occasions where the love letters worked out well too, because obviously there's things that buyers and sellers like about each other. So, it goes both ways. But me as a negotiator, I'm looking for the clues that are going to help my seller at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Michael, what's your take on a love letter and, of course, the initial question?
Yeah, the initial question is really, really easy to say what you should do and harder to live by when you're in the moment. It's really easy to say you should just stick to the terms and leave the personalities and people out of the negotiation and decision, but people are people. And if the love letter is presented, it can have the opposite effect that Ron just mentioned. I had one recently where a young couple made an offer on a house that our clients were an older couple. They had lived in the home for 37 or 38 years or something like that, moving to Florida. And the young couple buyers presented to our sellers a love letter about how this was going to be the perfect home for their new family they were starting, and it was beautiful and blah, blah, blah. And they loved what the sellers had done, and on and on and on. And the sellers got so attached to that love letter that they almost made a really bad decision about what they should do with their house. And we talked to them about it over and over again. In the end, that offer did not go through, and they got a much better offer over list price, sold in really quick time, and are now happily living in Florida. So it can work both ways. It can work for you and against you. So I'm not a huge fan of love letters either, but just because I think it's just more. I think it makes a lot more sense to try to concentrate on the terms and the facts of the offer and leave the people and personalities out. And it'll save you, and it'll save you the problem with fair housing.
Yeah. Good advice. Laura, what's your spin on this?
I'm with Ron in the camp of I'm going to present all offers and I'm going to present any information that's been given to me. And that is where you kind of get stuck in this conundrum of, but now I've given them information that they can't unsee or unfeel. I even had, it wasn't my transaction, but it was my aunt and uncle had a house in Huntley. This is years ago. And the people that wrote them a love letter that were buying it, they had two daughters the same exact age that theirs were when they bought the house. And it wasn't, and the guy wants to do more woodworking, and my uncle was a carpenter, and there was all these things that played into them just picturing themselves being young again with these two little kids. And it's like, you have to be careful. You have to be careful on all those things that we can't discriminate against. So when I receive them as an agent with an offer, I will screen them, but I will also go back to the agent and say, I just want to be mindful of the information that was presented in this and make sure, is there any adjustments you need to make sure that we are not violating fair housing for this offer to be considered. Some have redrafted or gone back to their clients because they can't edit it for them. But their clients have tried to rewrite it or make it more about the house. So if it's about the work or the improvements that were done and they're just complimenting the house, that's one thing. But to be talking about your background, your familial status, and all the things that are happening, that way can really muddy the waters. So I will still present it, and I will still ask them to consider all offers. Aside from that, I think, Michael, you talked earlier about doing that side-by-side comparison of the guts of the contract. I do the same thing, a spreadsheet that's just all the terms laid out side by side. And let's start with that before diving too deep into the other pieces that are presented.
All right. Yeah. So, Karen, what's your spin on the love letter, of course, and then the fair housing questions?
I think it's worked at times, but you have to be very careful with it. We don't use it very often for all those reasons. And as far as fair housing goes, I'm with Ron. When I go to discuss a contract with the seller, I'm going to look at everything before I show them the last page, before I show them any names. We're just going to talk about the facts. You know, are these people qualified to buy the house? How strong is their offer? How much are they putting down? Are they having anything back? Those are the things I want them to concentrate on. And most times I won't even look at price until we hit all the other things, like, is this closing date okay? How much are we putting down? How much earnest money? Things like that, because it's your job to look out for your seller. Sorry, that's my clock. And that's what you have to do. And those are the things that are important. And you want to get them to the closing table. So those are the things I look at. And I hope to get them to look at too.
I'm sorry.
I said, I hope get them to look at it too. And if they'll say to me, well, who's buying the house? And I'll say, it really doesn't matter at this point. You know, we just want to look at all the other things first, you know? And it's my worst nightmare is when, you know, buyers will stop by and the sellers are home or drive by, and then they chat, and it has never worked well, ever.
Yeah,
so I try to educate them, you know, please don't do that. But sometimes you just can't control them.
Right. I'm glad that we all had the same, the same idea with them. I guess it's a pro and a con, right? So there's a pro and a con to everything. So what are common mistakes that you see realtors make during multiple offer situations, maybe being on either side of the table? Laura, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, one, I think we touched on earlier, they don't have the written permission and direction from the seller to disclose that there are multiple offers. Also, not informing the realtors in an immediate fashion or in a consistent fashion. So I'm a fan of doing an email notice with a BCC to all the competing offer buyers agents. And I also think there's something I think it was Lynn Madison that had this in a CE, one of our broker management CE courses a while back, that said, consider calling it a reconsideration of offers, not highest and best. Because I know we've talked a lot on this about, it's not just about price, and highest and best kind of infers that, even though highest is about price, but best is about the other terms. Right. I think it kind of gets glossed over. So I like to call it a reconsideration of offers, because sometimes it doesn't mean you have to change it. You could resubmit the original offer. So I like that tip that I've gotten in the past as well, to kind of help, I think, keep it clean across the board. But the other thing I see a lot is there's a lot of agents that ask for who brought the other offer. And there's agents that I think have a misconception on what they have a right to know. And I know that per the standard of practice in the code of ethics, that you can ask if it's the listing agent, someone in that office, or another broker. But the listing agent is not required to disclose the actual agent where the other offer is coming from. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter. We're all professionals and we're all going to do the best we can for our clients. And I think to get ticky-tack on that fact is not important for your client that you're representing in a multiple offer situation. So I think that's something that I'm, as a managing broker, I've had agents come to me and be like, well, I want to know who did it. And I said, but what does it matter? It really doesn't. We're all doing our job. We shouldn't have to police each other that hard in that kind of situation. And that's what designated managing brokers are for too. So lean into them if you need it, but just remember that in that standard of practice as well.
Very good. Thank you. Karen, what's your take?
I think some of the mistakes are that they don't let everybody know that there's multiple offers as soon as possible. I've had a couple of my brokers call me and say they didn't even tell us that there were, multiple offers on the table, or that I needed highest and best by, X day. And so they get very frustrated then. So I think that's one of the things we have an issue with. And the other thing is, I think that people tend to get really excited when there's multiple offers because they think, oh, yay, my clients are going to get a lot for their house, and the sellers get excited like we've discussed before. So I try to remind everybody, we want to make it a win-win for both sides, for everybody, for our sellers, for our buyers, for both agents. And so we're always trying to be professional and make sure that, we're doing what's right by everybody.
Very good. Very good. Ron?
I think the biggest pitfall when it comes to multiple offers is communication. agents start to get, excited that they got multiple offers. Sellers get excited that they have multiple offers, and then they try to wait on one to give an answer and then make another agent mad. And most of the time, if you just upfront and tell other agents where we're at, provided you have seller's permission to discuss these things, then everybody's on the same page. If I know that I'm not going to get an answer for an offer in 12 hours, I'm going to be a lot more patient than if I submitted an offer and all of a sudden 2 hours later, I've got a buyer screaming at me because they don't have a response to their offer. And usually it comes down to communication. If I have open communication with the other agent and I know that the seller is considering multiple offers and they're not going to give a decision till the morning, then my buyer can be at ease, and wait for the decision, or make a different decision, even increase their offer, change their offer in some way. But communication being the biggest pitfall that we have in the multiple offer situation, because of all the things we talked about, escalations and just information that should be given to an agent. I think most of the time agents come to my attention, like Karen just mentioned, because they're frustrated because they didn't get an answer from another agent. That seems to be the biggest problem. So if we can at least be civil and discuss these things with the other agents, we'll be a lot better off in the multiple offer situation.
So Ron, another question for you kind of leads me to think about something else. So what's your take on agents? Some agents now don't return phone calls. They won't talk to you via the phone at all. They email or text. What's your take on that for either camp,
Yeah, I think there's a communication method that works best for everyone. Sometimes it's text, sometimes it's email, sometimes it's phone call. I'm looking for that sweet spot when I find, what the agent's communication style is. I'm one to answer my phone all the time, but that's not true for all agents. When it becomes 8 o'clock at night, you're not getting a phone call back. Yeah, I have to be a little bit sympathetic to that. Other, people have families. So I'm looking for the way that the agent wants to communicate, whether that be text, whether that be email, whether that be a phone call. And most often for me, I'm going to provide the same type of communication back that's come to me. So if it's in an email, I'm emailing it back. If it's a text, I'm texting it back. If it's a phone call, I'm phoning them back. So I think that's probably the best thing I can offer in regards to how to communicate better.
So you don't think the form of communication helps or hurts negotiation, whatever agent responds or replies to you?
Well, I think it hurts in some ways. The text message is certainly less personal, and an email you can get more information in, and a phone call being probably the best way you can read a negotiation. I always want to talk to the person so that I can find out the inflection in their voice, their hesitancies, what they really know about the mortgage process. Did you really speak to the mortgage agent? Those type of things. I much prefer a phone call, but if that doesn't work, then the other modes of communication will still work too.
Very good. Very good. Michael?
I think one of the common mistakes that are made a lot are that agents, I'm talking about agents more than clients, so the questions about realtors, is that, just playing cute, letting emotions or ego get in the way, not really focusing on the result. I don't know how training is provided to every single agent, but I think we try to coach my agents that negotiation's a process. It's not a game. It's not necessarily who has the highest score at the end. So I think that's a big mistake that people make, is getting kind of personally invested in the deal, as opposed to doing what I think our role is which is to be the least personal part of the transaction. Our job is to be advocates for whichever client we're handling, and I think sometimes the agents forget that and get a little bit too emotionally or egocentric in the deal, and that creates problems.
Yeah. What do you think about the the communication process, texting, email, do you think that it hurts or helps, or what's your take on that?
I think the key there is really the communication. I don't literally care how they communicate or in that regard in terms of mode, whether it's email or text or fax for that matter, if there's anybody still doing that. I think the problem a lot of agents have is just with the notion of communication. I think the mode is less important to me. I mean, I think, it's what we've all learned is you need to know who you're dealing with and what their preferred methods of communication are. And I actually kind of appreciate the agents who actually put in the listing remarks in the broker remarks. If you want to communicate with me about this offer, or if you've got an offer that you want to send me, here's how you communicate with me. I think that's really smart to do that. It's sort of setting the stage for how they're going to communicate with you. So I don't care too much about the mode. I just, there needs to be, sort of consistent and solid communication to make a deal work.
I personally like emails because I like to have documentation. And I usually like to follow it up with a phone call, but I think the most important part, as everybody has said, is that we communicate. There is nothing more frustrating, and as a managing broker, those are my most frustrations with my brokers, is that people aren't responding. And I think sometimes it's hard. You don't want to have to call somebody up and say you didn't get it, or, whatever the case may be. But communication is key. So again, as Michael said, I don't really care how they do it. I prefer emails so I can have documentation, but phone calls are nice because it's nice to put a voice with a name, but just to communicate. That's the most important.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think on kind of what Ron was saying, the mode may not matter, but as long as it's clear and timely. I think those are the two things that I would hope for in any kind of communication, whether it's text, email, or voicemail. I prefer voice-to-voice negotiations. I prefer to hear the tone and intention behind the sentiments that somebody's trying to give me in negotiating. So I do that. But then to your point, Karen, I actually will follow up with an email to document, as we discussed on the phone earlier today, here's where we're at. So I do have a record and a documentation of what's transpired over the phone, but I do like to have that conversation voice to voice. Even if somebody keeps emailing me, I'll probably call them back. I won't always, if it's in negotiations. So I try to always keep that line, because I feel like that's how I can best serve my client as well, rather than just a quick text with, a bullet point of counteroffer items. That's not, I think, the best way to get it done. And I think this transaction goes smoother when you open up that kind of direct communication with an agent from the moment you present an offer all the way to closing. And I feel like I have so many situations where that voice to voice and those phone calls just carry a lot more weight too.
Yeah, that's all good information. I had a deal myself where I never spoke to the agent once. It was all via email. It was kind of weird. I never met him at closing or her, and I just I don't know. It kind of made me feel like, are they alive? Is it someone's assistant? I didn't really know if I was dealing with an agent, quite honestly. That's
is it a robot? Maybe it's a robot.
Yeah, exactly. Is it? Yeah. So. Okay, so the next question is, what can we do as realtors to be prepared for multiple offer situations on the buying side and the selling side? Is there, obviously education, but how do we address that? How do we educate, and what do we tell our agents and our clients?
I think that's the most important piece. In order to be successful for your sellers or your buyers, you need to go over all this stuff at the very beginning. Kind of go through a lot of the scenarios a few times, once when you're first sitting down with them, and then as you're going out to show them houses, as you're getting the offers to come in, to continue to remind them that these are all the things that can happen. These are all the things we have to think about. And I even tell my buyers and my sellers, we want to make this a win-win for everybody. We want to make it a, nice transaction so that everybody walks away and feels like nobody was taken advantage of, and that everybody comes away with a good feeling about it. It always happens that way. but not for lack of trying. So I think those are the things in order to be prepared. We need to make sure it's really just about educating the client.
Yeah, you're right there. You're right there. Ron?
Yeah, I can't disagree. Education is probably most important here. To add a little bit of humor to the discussion, when I talk about things that can happen in a multiple offer situation, like both buyers walking away, it helps if you put a real life story behind it to my sellers and say, you know what, this has happened to me, and this is how we resolved it. This is what can happen. But if you add a little bit of humor to it as well, it softens the problems that are going to happen. These transactions, every transaction is different, and there's pitfalls for every transaction. I don't know any transaction that's ever been the same, for me. And so there's a lot of stories that we get to share over the course of a year's worth of experience, and you start to build on those, and they can add to your repertoire of things that you can share with your seller or your buyers. That relationship with your buyers and your sellers can be very easy as long as you add some humor and add some real life stories to these situations. But it's all about education, and the way you can educate is by telling stories about the things that can happen and things that do happen often. It doesn't mean it's going to happen to you, but I'll give you a good example. I sold a property on Saturday, and the seller told me that they sold their last two houses on the first day. And then we sold it on the second day, but she called me back to tell me that, and we had multiple offers, by the way, so that we sold it to the first buyer. And I said, no, I'm sorry, Christine, it was the second buyer, so I failed you. But we sold it in the weekend. So yeah, all good things happen.
Right. Laura?
Yeah, similar to what everyone's saying here. I always, when I sit down from that initial consultation with a buyer or a seller, I do talk about my fiduciary responsibility and my duty to them. And I remember that throughout the process, but then I also pave the pathways and scenarios, kind of like you guys are saying. I will show them all the potential ways this can go, sharing some real life examples and things like that. But I always will remind them that I may be in control of the process, but they're in control of the decisions. So it's always my process, your decision. And I help guide them along every step of the way of that process with the flow chart and show them kind of, here's where we're at, here's what's next, here's what to expect. So the education piece, setting expectations, all of that is key. But just making sure that they know they're in charge of the decisions and their destiny.
A lot of what has been said already, pretty much where I started or earlier in this discussion. I think the advanced consultation is probably the most important part of this, although, being a great negotiator is also very important. But I think you do all the hard work up front. I think, if you do a good job with the buyer consultation or the listing presentation, you really can kind of accomplish two things when you're doing that. One is you're going to set the stage for what's going to happen later on, and you're going to be able to refer to it, and they're going to remember, and they're not going to have to try to figure out what the process is in the heat of the moment. So that's a really good advantage to be in. The other is if you do a really good job on the consultation piece of it, and the transaction goes the way it needs to go, and you end up helping them, buy the house of their dreams. I think it also helps validate the fact of our worth. I mean, that we earn every penny that we make in a transaction. You could just write a contract on an offer, or you could be their advocate all the way through before they even saw that property until they take the keys. And I think there's a different mentality about that. So I think that advanced consultation, knowing the client, insiding out their parameters. And I know it's not all about the numbers, but I think we have to be the smartest people in the room about what the numbers are on any transaction that we're working on, so that we can properly inform the client. So I think all those things are really important for realtors to be aware of. And then, you know, as realtors, you should invest in some education on in learning how to be a great negotiator, because a big part of our job is negotiation, and that's where we really prove our worth a lot of times. So I think it's something that every realtor should consider doing.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. So I do have one question, and then we can wrap this up. I know we're getting on a little bit later than planned, but the one question I have is something we didn't talk about that maybe might happen in multiple other situations that maybe you guys think is important. Would like to share. Ron, would you like to start?
Boy, we've covered a lot of road work here. I don't know that I have anything more to add in regards to added things to consider. I guess just to highlight the things that I thought were most important is the communication and education with your clients. I agree with Michael's last point in regards to that consultation in the beginning. It sets the stage for the whole transaction. I agree. And, you know, the more education we can do with our buyers and our sellers, the better off the transaction will be, the smoother it'll be for your seller and your buyer in the multiple offer situation, because it is a high tense, emotional part of the transaction, and it can get out of hand very easily. We can get to a point where they've spent more money than they want to, or a seller has pushed too hard and lost all the potential buyers that they have. So education and communication.
Thank you, Ron. Michael?
I think you really appreciate a great realtor when you work with one in a transaction, and you really see how bad a not great realtor is when you work with them in a transaction. I prefer to work with the former. You know, there are a lot of great realtors out there, but and those realtors have probably one or a couple of things in common, and those things are that they take their job serious. They understand their clients, they work with their clients, they're educated, they know what they're doing in the business, they treat us and other realtors with respect, they communicate, they pretty much follow the code of ethics. I think it's important, you know, that realtors, if you're going to be in this game, if you're going to play in this field, you know, you need to know what you're doing, and you need to be you need to do all the things you can do to be a great negotiator and a great communicator. And I think that plays out in all the things we've talked about today.
Perfect. Laura?
Yeah, just really mirroring what everybody else has said. I think as long as we are all subscribed to being lifelong learners, I've been in the business 15 years. I managed for almost 10, and every deal is different. I think, like Ron said earlier, I think setting expectations and being here, I mean, listening to this and being a part of this right now. So to anybody watching or listening in, it's huge to take that step for your business, to always work to be a better version of yourself tomorrow and a better realtor tomorrow than you were today. So just subscribe to always be learning. And I think we'll all do well for each other.
Thank you all for being part of this panel. We're going to have one panel every month. Our next panel is going to be about creating business through the holidays. And then in January, we're going to hit on security. So the Ring doorbells, the security cameras, the nanny cams in the house, that'll be our next two monthly events coming up to talk on. Thank you all very much for being part of this. It's been great. I've taken a lot away from it myself. There's always, if you get one thing out of it, it's worth doing, right? So
right.
It's been very very delightful for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was
Thanks,
enjoyable.
Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce.